The wind howled over the red dust of Arizona territory, carrying with it the scent of rain and gunpowder. It was the spring of 1885, a time when the border between life and death was drawn by the width of a trigger pull. And into that uncertain land rode Marjorie Kane, a 30-year-old woman whose past clung to her like the dust on her boots. She wasn't like other women who hid behind parasols and prayers. Marjorie had lost both luxury and illusion years ago. Once the wife of a cavalry officer, now she was a widow, wandering westward with nothing but a half-broken mare, a worn satchel, and the will to start again. Her husband, Captain Elijah Kane, had died in an ambush with the Apache 5 years earlier, or so the Army said. The truth, as she would soon learn, was far more complicated. Marjorie rode through the desolate hills, following an old trade trail rumored to lead toward an abandoned silver camp near Dry Creek Ridge. Her hands were blistered, her canteen half empty, but her eyes were fixed ahead, blue-gray and unflinching. The towns she passed through whispered about her. That's the widow who don't talk much. Others said she carried secrets in that satchel that could buy a man's freedom, or his death. At dusk, as the sky bled into crimson and gold, she saw smoke curling from a distant ridge. Her horse tensed beneath her. Outlaws, maybe, or worse, soldiers. But when she approached, she saw something unexpected. A solitary Apache warrior, seated by a small fire, unarmed except for a knife tied to his belt. His face was painted in faded ochre and white, his black hair bound with feathers that danced in the wind. Their eyes met, and the world fell silent. Marjorie's hand instinctively went to the small revolver in her saddlebag. The man didn't flinch. He simply watched her, steady and still, as if he'd been expecting her all along. "You're far from any town," he said in English so calm it unnerved her. His accent was rough, but his voice had gravity, the kind that came from surviving what others couldn't. "I could say the same," Marjorie replied, her voice low. "I thought your kind kept to the mountains." He gave a faint smile. "And I thought you stayed behind fences." For a long moment, they said nothing. The fire crackled between them, a fragile truce in a land built on blood. Finally, she dismounted, exhausted and weary, and gestured toward his fire. "Mind if I rest here a while?" He nodded once, slow. "You can. The night is colder than it looks." She sat, arms wrapped around her knees, and watched him cook strips of venison over the flame. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was ancient. Every sound, the rustle of wind, the cry of a coyote, seemed sharpened by it. After a time, she asked, "You have a name?" He looked at her for a moment before answering. "Tahoné. It means the one who walks away." "A fitting name," she said quietly. "Seems like we both did some walking away." His dark eyes softened. Then maybe fate brought two wanderers to the same fire. Her chest tightened. Something about his calmness disarmed her more than any weapon could. She had grown used to pitying glances, to men who spoke kindly only to control her. But this man, this Apache, regarded her like an equal. Not as a victim, not as a prize. When the storm rolled in near midnight, lightning ripped through the sky. Her mare reared and broke free, bolting into the dark. Panic gripped her. All her supplies were packed on that horse. She ran out into the rain, shouting the animal's name, but it was gone. "Let it go," Tahoné said, stepping out of the firelight, rain streaming down his shoulders. "The night will swallow it." "I can't," she snapped, her voice trembling. "That's all I have left." He caught her wrist before she could run again. His touch was firm, but not cruel. "You have life. You have will. Those are worth more." Their eyes met again, closer now, and for the first time in years she felt seen. Thunder cracked overhead. Somewhere in that wild darkness, destiny stirred. Marjorie didn't know it yet. But this man, the one her husband once called enemy, would soon kneel before her with a question that would shake the entire frontier. The storm raged across the desert like a beast loosed from the heavens. Marjorie Kane crouched under a jut of sandstone, soaked to the bone, shivering as wind tore through the canyon. The fire was long gone, drowned by the downpour. She could barely see Tahoné through the sheets of rain, but his silhouette was steady. Moving with purpose rather than panic, he disappeared into the darkness, saying only, "Stay here." Marjorie pressed her back against the cold rock, clutching her satchel as thunder cracked overhead. The rain poured down her hat brim and over her lips, salty and bitter. She hated depending on anyone, especially a man she had met only hours ago. But when lightning flashed again, she saw him returning, leading her mare by the reins. The horse's flanks heaved, and its eyes were wide, but it was alive. He had gone after it, in the middle of the storm. Couldn't let her vanish. Tahoné said simply, his voice nearly drowned by the wind. "You said it was all you had left." Marjorie's throat tightened. "You could have been killed out there." He shrugged, raindrops glistening off his bare shoulders. "The desert has tried before." He tied the horse near the rock face, then joined her beneath the overhang. His nearness was strangely comforting. He radiated a quiet steadiness she hadn't felt since before her husband's death. For a while neither spoke. Only the storm spoke for them, roaring and weeping across the empty land. When dawn came, the sky broke open to pale gold. Steam rose from the drenched ground, and the desert smelled of wet sage and new beginnings. Marjorie stirred from half-sleep, and found Tahoné watching the horizon, kneeling beside the fire he had managed to rekindle. The light caught the edges of his face, strong jaw, unyielding eyes, and a sadness buried deep beneath calm. "You didn't sleep," she said quietly. "Didn't need to," he replied. "Dreams don't bring rest." She almost smiled. "You sound like someone who's been through too much." "I have," he said. Then, after a pause, "And yet not enough to stop me from helping a lost soul." That startled her. "I'm not lost." He looked at her, and for the first time, his expression sharpened. "Then why do you keep running?" She froze. The question hit harder than a bullet. Her hands trembled as she reached into her satchel and pulled out a weathered envelope, its seal broken and edges frayed. "This letter," she murmured, "came from Fort Darrington. It says my husband died in an Apache ambush, your people." Tahoné's gaze didn't waver. "You came looking for vengeance?" "No," she said, her voice breaking. "I came looking for truth, the kind no one in uniform would tell me." He studied her for a long time, then nodded slowly. "Then you came to the right fire." That night, when the stars returned, Tahoné told her what really happened. He spoke of a raid gone wrong, soldiers attacking a peaceful Apache camp, of men who fired before asking, of how the bloodshed that followed scarred both sides forever. Her husband had been there, yes, but not as a victim. He was one of the officers who led the attack. Marjorie's chest tightened as if the air had turned to stone. "You're lying." Tahoné didn't flinch. "I was there. I saw him. And I saw the woman he tried to protect, my sister." Her breath caught. "Your sister?" "She died that day," Tahoné said quietly. "Your husband tried to stop the shooting. He failed. He died with her blood on his hands and soldiers' bullets in his back." The world seemed to tilt. The man she'd mourned, the man she'd cursed, now tangled in truth she could hardly grasp. She turned away, tears stinging her eyes. Tahoné said nothing more. He only placed a blanket over her shoulders before retreating to his own corner of the camp. Marjorie stared into the dying fire, her mind a storm fiercer than the one outside. The enemy she had been taught to hate had just handed her the truth, and in that truth, something impossible was forming. Not anger, not fear, but a quiet, unbearable understanding Dot by the time the fire turned to embers. She looked toward him again, the man she should despise, and realized something she hadn't felt in years: safety. And as the desert dawn broke once more, she knew this was no chance meeting Dot, it was fate's cruel, mysterious design. The morning sun hung low over the desert, its light soft but merciless. Every rock, every cactus, seemed carved from the same endless silence. Marjorie Kane sat by the fire, her mind echoing with the words Tahoné had spoken the night before. "Your husband died with my sister's blood on his hands." She turned those words over like stones in her palm, heavy and sharp. For years she had carried grief like armor. But now, truth had cracked that armor wide open, and she wasn't sure what was left beneath. Tahoné approached quietly, his shadow falling across the sand. His long black hair, still damp from the rain, gleamed under the sun. He carried a piece of dried meat and handed it to her without a word. She hesitated, then accepted. "Where will you go now?" he asked, his tone careful. Marjorie looked toward the distant horizon. "There's a town, Dry Creek Ridge. They say it's half ghosted now, but there's an old prospector there who used to serve under my husband. If anyone can confirm what really happened that day, it's him." Tahoné nodded once. "Then I'll take you there." She blinked. "You don't owe me that." He looked at her steadily. "Maybe not. But the truth owes us both something." By midday, they were riding through the canyon. The land stretched wide, a sea of copper and bone, dotted with juniper trees and distant vultures circling overhead. Tahoné rode ahead on a chestnut stallion he had caught and tamed himself. Marjorie followed, her mare steady but slow. For hours they rode in silence, broken only by the creak of saddles and the low hum of wind through stone. At times she caught herself watching him, the quiet way he scanned the horizon, the precision in his movements, the strength that seemed both wild and disciplined. There was something sacred about him, something untamed but honorable. As they rode through a narrow pass, Tahoné suddenly raised a hand. "Stop." Marjorie's horse halted. "What is it?" she whispered. He pointed toward a ridge above them. "Riders." She followed his gaze, 3 silhouettes against the sun. Outlaws by their slouched posture and the rifles glinting on their backs. Tahoné's voice lowered. "They've been following since dawn. Stay close." They pushed forward, the sound of hoofbeats echoing off canyon walls. Within minutes, the riders began to descend, closing in. "Go!" Tahoné shouted, spurring his horse forward. Marjorie held tight to the reins as bullets tore through the silence. One grazed the rock beside her, another split her hat brim. They thundered through the gorge, dust and gunfire swirling. Tahoné turned in his saddle, firing an arrow so quick and clean it struck one of the riders' horses, sending it tumbling. Another outlaw fell back, cursing, but the third kept coming. As they reached an old wooden bridge spanning a dried-out gulch, Tahoné leapt from his horse, cutting one of the ropes that held the bridge steady. It swayed dangerously. "Cross," he ordered. Marjorie's voice trembled. "You'll be trapped on that side." "Go, Marjorie," he shouted, the first time he'd spoken her name aloud. She rode across, her heart pounding. The moment her horse reached the other side, Tahoné sliced the second rope. The bridge gave way just as the last rider charged forward. Wood splintered, dust rose, and the outlaw disappeared into the canyon below. When the echoes faded, Marjorie looked back. Tahoné stood on the opposite ridge, his chest heaving, hair whipping in the wind. He was alive, barely. She cupped her hands and shouted, "There's another path down the ravine. Meet me by the creek." Hours later, they reunited at sunset, both bruised and dusted with the day's fight. Marjorie dismounted, her legs weak. "You could have died back there." He looked at her, eyes burning with something deeper than pride. Then it would have been a worthy death. She stared at him, the man her world once called enemy now risking his life for hers. She wanted to speak, but the words caught in her throat as they made camp near the creek. The tension between them thickened, neither knowing what to name it. The line between gratitude and something far more dangerous had begun to blur. When she finally lay down beneath the stars, she heard him softly chanting in his native tongue a prayer. Low and mournful. She didn't understand the words, but she felt them. And that night, as she drifted to sleep, one thought would not leave her mind, that perhaps fate hadn't brought her to Tahoné for answers, but for something far more profound. The desert had gone quiet again. After 2 days of riding through burned-out plains and dry riverbeds, Marjorie Kane and Tahoné reached the edge of Dry Creek Ridge, or what was left of it. Once a bustling mining town, it now stood half buried in sand and silence. Roofs sagged. Doors hung loose. The only sound was the creak of an old sign swinging in the wind. Saloon and Supply. Est 1879. Marjorie's throat tightened. This is it. The last place anyone saw my husband alive. Tahoné dismounted and tied his horse to a post that looked ready to collapse. You said a prospector lives here? If he's still breathing, she said, brushing the dust from her coat. They walked down the abandoned main street, the boards creaking beneath their boots. The place smelled of old whiskey, rust, and ghosts. Marjorie's nerves buzzed with both dread and purpose. She wasn't sure what truth she wanted anymore, only that it was time to stop running from it. Near the far end of the street, a faint light flickered from a shack. Tahoné approached first, hand on his knife. Stay behind me, he said softly. Inside sat a thin, weathered man hunched over a lantern. Jed Barker, a name Marjorie remembered from her husband's army papers. His face was a roadmap of scars and whiskey veins, but his eyes sharpened when he saw them. Marjorie Kane. He rasped, I thought you'd never come. She froze. You know who I am? Everyone who survived Fort Darrington does. He coughed, the sound like sandpaper. You're here about Elijah. Yes, she said, her voice trembling. I was told he died in an Apache ambush. But this man, she glanced at Tahoné, claims it wasn't that simple. Jed gave a bitter laugh. He's right. Nothing about that day was simple. He poured a shot of whiskey, hands shaking. Your husband wasn't killed by savages. He was killed by his own men. The room fell silent except for the whistle of the wind outside. What? She whispered. Jed's single quotes esques flicked to Tahoné. We were ordered to move the Apaches off their land. Elijah refused. Said there were women and children in that camp. Our captain didn't care. Told us to fire anyway. Elijah tried to stop it, pulled rank, shouted, even stood between the lines. That's when Sergeant Miller shot him. In the back. Blamed it on the Apaches after. Marjorie's knees nearly gave way. The floor tilted. My God. Jed nodded grimly. He died trying to save them. Your husband wasn't the monster folks made him out to be, nor the hero the papers claimed. He was just a man who couldn't live with orders. Tahoné's jaw tightened. And my sister? Yet's voice cracked. She was hit in the crossfire. Elijah tried to save her. They both bled out before sunset. For a long moment, no one spoke. The truth, raw and unforgiving, hung between them like a ghost that refused to rest. Marjorie turned away, tears streaking her dust-covered face. Tahoné stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder. It was gentle, but it steadied her more than words ever could. You came for truth, he said quietly. Now you have it. She looked up at him, eyes red but fierce. And what now? Do we just ride away? He hesitated. No, we ride to Fort Darrington. The man who killed your husband still breathes. And if you want peace, you must face him. For a heartbeat, she said nothing. Then she nodded slowly. Then I'll face him, but I won't do it alone. Tahoné gave a small, solemn smile. You won't have to. They spent that night in the ruins of the saloon. The wind howled through broken windows, but for the first time, Marjorie didn't feel hollow. The ache inside her had shifted from grief to resolve. She sat near the fire, watching Tahoné sharpen his knife. The flicker of flame painting gold across his scarred chest and the turquoise beads around his neck. His presence filled the room like quiet thunder. You risked your life for me, she said softly. Why? He didn't look up. Because you carried the same fire my sister did. And because... He paused, meeting her gaze now. I see something in you that I thought the world had killed long ago, mercy. Her heart stilled. The air between them thickened, and for a fleeting moment, neither the storm nor the past existed. Only two souls, broken in different ways, finding reason to keep riding outside. The desert wind whispered like a warning that mercy and love were dangerous companions. And in the morning, when they saddled up for Fort Darrington, destiny rode with them. By the next morning, the sun was a pale coin rising over a scarred horizon. The air was dry and sharp, carrying the scent of dust and distance. Marjorie Kane rode beside Tahoné, her thoughts a storm that refused to quiet. The truth about her husband had burned away the lies she'd lived under, but it hadn't brought peace. Only questions. Do you ever stop thinking? Tahoné asked softly as they rode. Marjorie smiled faintly. Only when I sleep. Then you think too much, he said, almost teasing. For a brief moment, she laughed, a sound she hadn't made in years. But it didn't last long. Ahead, the barren trail twisted toward the hills where Fort Darrington lay, the place where everything had begun, and where everything would end. Hours passed. The wind grew hot, the land turning from red to gold. When the fort came into view, it was not the proud garrison the army once boasted of. Half the walls had caved in. The flags were tattered. Soldiers moved like ghosts, weary and half-drunk, their discipline lost to years of moral decay. Tahoné slowed his horse. If they see me, they will shoot. Marjorie's eyes hardened. Then they'll shoot me first. He gave her a look, part frustration, part admiration. You are more stubborn than any warrior I've met. And you're still here, she countered. They left their horses hidden behind a ridge and walked the rest of the way on foot. Marjorie wore her late husband's badge, a small token that might buy her a few words before bullets. When they entered the fort's outer yard, a sentry rose from his chair, squinting. Ma'am, this place ain't for visitors, he said, leaning on his rifle. I'm not visiting, she said coldly. I'm here to see Sergeant Miller. The sentry hesitated, then pointed toward the command building. End of the hall. But he don't take kindly to ghosts from the past. Tahoné's hand brushed the hilt of his knife. Then he will meet too. Inside, the air stank of sweat, tobacco, and gun oil. They found Miller seated at a desk, older and heavier, but still wearing arrogance like a badge. When he saw Marjorie, the color drained from his face. Marjorie Kane, he muttered. You thought you buried the truth, she cut in, voice like steel. You murdered my husband. Miller stood, his expression hardening. You don't know what you're talking about. Tahoné stepped forward, his presence filling the room. We both do. You shot a man who refused to kill women and children. You blamed it on us. Miller's hand drifted to the revolver on his belt. You watch your tongue, savage. Tahoné didn't move, but his eyes flashed like fire. You call me savage, yet you're the one who kills for orders. Marjorie moved between them, voice rising. You lied to me. You made me believe Elijah died a hero in your war. But you're the coward who shot him in the back. Miller's jaw clenched. You wouldn't understand. The frontier don't reward mercy. Neither does your conscience, she said coldly. In a blur, Miller drew his gun, but before he could aim, Tahoné's knife flashed through the air, striking the weapon from his hand. The gun clattered across the floor. Miller backed away, his face pale. You won't kill me, Miller hissed. You're not like them. Tahoné's eyes burned with quiet rage. No, I'm not. But the desert remembers what you did, and someday it will take you. Miller's pride cracked. He stumbled back into his chair, sweat pouring down his temples. Get out, he muttered. Both of you. Marjorie turned to go, but paused at the door. You'll live with what you've done, she said softly. And that will be worse than death. They stepped out into the light. The fort behind them seemed smaller now, a rotting monument to cruelty and regret. As they walked back toward the horses, Tahoné said, You have your truth now. What will you do with it? Marjorie took a long breath. I think it's time I stopped living in someone else's shadow. He nodded, though something unreadable flickered in his eyes. That night, they camped by the river beneath a sky so full of stars it seemed unreal. Marjorie sat close to the fire, her reflection shimmering on the water. Tahoné watched her quietly, the woman who had faced soldiers without flinching, who had carried pain with dignity. When she looked up, their eyes met. For the first time, he reached out, brushing his fingers against hers. You have more courage than any man I've known, he said softly. In my people's way, when a soul meets another that mirrors its own, it is a bond, sacred, unbroken. Marjorie's heart raced. What are you saying, Tahoné? He stood, the firelight casting golden shadows across his chest and the turquoise beads around his neck. Then he knelt before her, calm, strong, unashamed. I am saying, he murmured, that I will walk beside you, not as a warrior guarding an enemy, but as a man who has found the other half of his soul. The fire crackled. The desert wind stilled. And for a moment, even the stars seemed to stop their burning. The sun bled low across the desert horizon as silence swallowed the remnants of battle. The air still carried the scent of gunpowder and sweat, mingled with the faint sweetness of sagebrush crushed under boots. Fort Darrington had fallen quiet, only the wind whispered between its cracked walls. Marjorie Kane sat on a pile of fallen timber, her dress torn, hands still trembling. She had fought beside Tahoné, the Apache warrior who had saved her more times than she could count. Now, with the soldiers gone and the fort in ruins, the two of them faced each other alone for the first time since all this began. Tahoné stood in the fading light, his powerful frame haloed by the dying sun. His long black hair flowed freely, streaked with dust and streaks of blood that weren't all his own. His chest rose and fell, calm but steady, and the turquoise beads at his neck glimmered faintly like stars just beginning to wake. You could leave, Marjorie said softly, her voice hoarse. You've done what you came for. You avenged your people. You owe me nothing. Tahoné turned to her, his dark eyes unreadable. A man who saves a life owes more than he can repay, he said. But I don't stay because I owe you. I stay because the wind has chosen to stop here with you. Marjorie felt something twist deep in her chest. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like the widow hiding behind duty or regret. She felt alive. But the thought terrified her. You don't know what you're saying, she whispered. I'm no woman for a warrior like you. I've buried too much, seen too much. He stepped closer, his shadow falling across her. And yet, you still fight, he said quietly. You still believe in right when others only believe in survival. He reached down and took her hand-rough, calloused fingers brushing her trembling ones. Marjorie Kane, I have walked alone since my tribe burned. I have trusted no one. But when I saw you raise that rifle against your own men to save my life, I knew my spirit had found its answer. Her breath caught. Tahoné. He knelt before her, his bare knees pressing into the dust. The warrior who had faced death without flinching now looked up at her as if she were the only truth left in the world. In my people's way, he said, his voice steady, when a man finds the one who holds his spirit still, he offers his fire to her. It means his heart, his home, his life. Her eyes widened, realization dawning. You're proposing? The ghost of a smile touched his lips. Yes, though your people call it different. For a long moment, she couldn't speak. The world seemed to slow around them, the sky burning orange, the wind humming low through the canyon. She looked at him, at the proud lines of his face, the scars that told stories older than any promise, the tenderness that hid behind the steel. Tahoné, she finally said, voice breaking, if I say yes, the world will turn on us. You know that. I have already faced the world, he said simply. It has nothing left to take. Tears welled in her eyes. The soldier's widow, the wanderer, the outcast, she had lived her life behind walls of grief. But now, in front of her, was a man who had every reason to hate, yet chose to love instead. Slowly, she reached out and touched his cheek. Then I'll face it with you. The warrior's eyes softened. He stood, pulling her gently to her feet. As the desert wind swept around them, he pressed his forehead to hers in silent reverence. In the Apache way, no words were needed. The sky itself bore witness to their bond. For a long moment, the world was still. Then, from somewhere in the distance, a thunderclap rolled across the horizon, not a storm, but the echo of something eternal, sealing their promise beneath the dying light. When they finally turned toward the mountains, hand in hand, neither looked back at the fort or the town beyond it. They had both buried their pasts there. What awaited them ahead was uncertain, but it was theirs, and as they walked into the red glow of twilight, even the wind seemed to whisper their names, two lost souls found, defying the old world with something far stronger than vengeance, love. The night air over the desert was still so still that every heartbeat seemed to echo. The last embers of the sunset had faded into a deep indigo sky, strewn with stars that glittered like ancient eyes. Tahoné and Marjorie rode side by side, the rhythmic sound of hooves the only sign of life across the endless stretch of sand and stone. They had left Fort Darrington behind, its broken walls swallowed by the horizon. Ahead lay the unknown wild lands, where neither the law nor vengeance could reach them. Marjorie pulled her coat tighter as the wind grew cold. Do you ever think we'll find peace out here? She asked quietly, her voice carried by the breeze. Tahoné didn't answer right away. His gaze was fixed on the distant ridges, where the moonlight caught the silver edges of cacti. Peace is not something you find, he said at last. It's something you decide to keep. She smiled faintly. Then maybe we both deserve a little of it. They rode until the moon climbed high, and finally stopped near a dried-up riverbed lined with white stones that shimmered faintly in the moonlight. Tahoné dismounted, his long black hair falling over his shoulders as he tended to the horses. The muscles of his back moved like sculpted stone beneath his bronzed skin, still adorned with his tribal beads and feathers. Marjorie watched him silently, feeling a strange calm wash over her. For the first time in years, she wasn't running from ghosts, she was walking beside one who had become her reason to live. When the fire was lit, they sat close, the glow painting gold across their faces. Tahoné's expression was quiet but thoughtful. When the storm passed, he began, I saw my people again in a dream. They stood in the canyon of the moon, watching me. My mother spoke first. She said, You have walked the trail of fire, and still you choose love. That is the courage we could not teach. Marjorie's eyes softened. She would be proud of you, Tahoné. He looked at her with that calm intensity she had come to know. Perhaps. But tonight, the desert must decide if it accepts us. She tilted her head. What do you mean? He stood and extended his hand. Come. She took it, and he led her a few steps away from the fire until they stood under the open sky. The stars above seemed impossibly close. Tahoné raised his arms, speaking in Apache, his voice low but powerful like the earth itself was listening. The words were foreign to her, but their rhythm felt like a song older than time. When he finished, he turned to her. In my people's way, we ask the land to bless what we cannot promise, to forgive what the world will not. She felt tears sting her eyes. And what does it say? He looked up again, and for a heartbeat, the wind rose, swirling around them, lifting dust and ember. The fire flickered blue for a brief instant. It says it hears us, he murmured. It says it will remember. Marjorie stepped closer until she was standing inches from him. Then let it remember this, she whispered, and she kissed him. It wasn't the soft, uncertain kiss of two strangers. It was fierce, full of everything they had survived, everything they had lost, and everything they dared to hope for. Tahoné's hands moved to her waist, pulling her closer as the wind howled through the desert, carrying their silhouettes against the fireht when they finally broke apart. She rested her head against his chest, hearing the steady beat of his heart. What happens now? She asked quietly. Tahoné smiled faintly, looking toward the horizon. Now we live, not as Apache, not as a widow, but as what the desert made us, two souls the world could not break. They stayed awake long into the night, the stars above burning brighter than ever. The desert, vast and eternal, whispered around them, not with loneliness, but with life. By dawn, they rode again, side by side, toward the far hills painted in morning gold. Behind them, the wind erased their tracks, as if the earth itself was protecting their story. And though the world would one day forget their names, the desert never did. For every night the wind crossed those sands, it carried the same soft murmur. Tahoné, Marjorie. The ones who chose love when the world demanded war. It was said that if you listened close, enough near the old riverbed under the stars, you could still hear the echo of their laughter, the promise of their love. And the voice of the desert whispering back, I remember.